Meryl Streep is not merely the greatest actress of her generation, she is cinema's quiet heartbeat, the metronome of truth that steadies our pulse when a story dares to look us in the eye. From Sophie's Choice to The Devil Wears Prada, from the tremor of grief to the blade of power, she turned performance into pilgrimage, stepping into other lives so fully that we forgot where she ended and we began. But legends don't glow, they smolder. And at 76, the light around Meryl has changed temperature. The applause is softer now, traded for long walks under Connecticut trees and scripts chosen like prayers. Those who know her speak less. Those who guess at her life speak more. Behind the statues and the standing ovations lies a woman who paid for honesty with silence, who protected her children, her marriage, and her private grief, the way she protected every character she ever loved, completely. There are wounds you don't see, the ulcer that came with youth and hunger for craft, the love that died too early and never stopped living inside her, the marriage that became two houses and a vow to remain kind, the industry that crowned her a goddess and then, as always, asked what a goddess is worth when she refuses to perform off stage. Yet when she returned in Only Murders in the Building, the world remembered. The flame never left. What happened to Meryl Streep at 76? Not a scandal, not a fall from grace, something more unsettling for a culture addicted to noise. A woman choosing her life carefully, tenderly, even as the past breathes at the edges and time steals its quiet tax. The question is not whether she remains a legend, it's what the legend costs. There are few names in Hollywood that feel eternal. Meryl Streep is one of them. She stands not just as an actress, but as an institution. A sacred measure of artistic truth, her presence redefined what it means to act. For decades, she didn't just play characters. She embodied contradictions, fragility and fury, intellect and instinct, perfection and vulnerability. She was not built for fame. She was built for depth. And that is precisely what made her timeless. When Meryl Streep first appeared on screen in the 1970 seconds, the world was still learning what women could be. The era of silent submission was cracking open, giving rise to a new kind of heroine, complex, intelligent, and flawed. Yet, even in that shifting landscape, few expected a soft-spoken girl from New Jersey to become the emotional core of American cinema. She was neither glamorous by conventional Hollywood standards nor desperate to please. She entered quietly and then made silence her weapon. Her ascent was never loud. There were no scandals, no carefully staged publicity storms, only performances that hit like poetry and lingered like grief. Kramer versus Predicts. Kramer taught us that love and loss can coexist in the same breath. The French Lieutenant's Woman blurred the line between fiction and reality. Sophie's Choice ripped open humanity itself, forcing audiences to confront pain that had no resolution. With every role, she challenged what beauty meant, not something you see, but something you feel. To critics, she was a chameleon. Acting is not about being someone else, she once said. It's about finding the similarity in what is apparently different, then finding myself there. That statement was more than philosophy, it was confession. For Meryl, every performance was a form of translation. She took human suffering, confusion, and longing, and turned them into something luminous. Yet in that alchemy, she paid a price. The gradual erosion of her private self. Fame to her was not a throne. It was a spotlight that demanded pieces of her soul. Behind the grace and golden trophies was a woman balancing on the razor's edge between art and existence, between the camera's hunger and her need for stillness, between the demands of a world that wanted her to speak and her lifelong instinct to remain silent. Her silence wasn't pride. It was preservation. In interviews, she often deflected questions about herself, as if speaking too directly would puncture the delicate balance that kept her whole. "I have an active inner life," she'd smile, "and I like to keep it that way." She understood something most in Hollywood never grasped, that mystery is not absence. It's power. In an industry that feeds on exposure, Meryl Streep chose endurance. Through the decades, she became more than an actress. She became a mirror. Every generation saw something different in her reflection. The anxious mother, the betrayed wife, the grieving lover, the iron-fisted leader, the woman aging on her own terms. Each role was a chapter in a long, quiet novel about survival. But as the years passed, her performances began to thin out. And those who followed her career closely began to notice a stillness, as if the very woman who taught the world how to feel was now holding back tears of her own. Because the truth, as it often does, hides behind the applause. The world celebrated her achievements, but few knew the losses that shaped them, the love that ended too soon, the health scares, the isolation that came with protecting her family from the machine of fame. Those who have seen her recently say her presence remains radiant, but her eyes, those famously expressive eyes, carry a quiet, permanent ache. The greatest performances are not written, they're lived. And in the theater of life, Meryl Streep has played her most difficult role, yet the act of growing older, alone but unbroken, in a world that rarely forgives women for either. Before the world called her the greatest living actress, before the red carpets, the ovations, and the myth, there was a little girl named Mary Louise Streep, a shy child in thick glasses, more comfortable watching than being watched. Born on the 22nd of June 1949 in Summit, New Jersey, she grew up in a world that seemed too loud for her softness. Her father, Harry William Streep Jr., was a pharmaceutical executive, precise, logical, a man of formulas and fixed truths. Her mother, Mary Wilkinson Streep, was the opposite, a free-spirited artist who painted outside the lines, laughed at convention, and told her daughter she could be anything. Between them, young Meryl learned her first paradox, that life could demand both control and chaos, and that perhaps art was the only place the two could coexist. At home, she sang constantly, not to perform, but to fill the space where conversation failed. Her parents were loving, but distant in the way of the 1,950 seconds. Emotions were folded neatly away, manners replacing confession. So Meryl's earliest form of rebellion was sound, the hum of her voice, the mimicry of accents she'd hear on the radio, the spontaneous recitations of Shakespeare to the family dog. It was her way of saying, "I'm here," in a household where feelings weren't always welcomed. By 12, her parents enrolled her in opera lessons under the formidable Estelle Liebling, a voice coach whose students once sang at the Metropolitan Opera. Meryl was good, frighteningly good. Her voice, they said, was pure and agile, the kind that could have conquered any stage. And that was the first time I understood what it meant to lie on stage. It was an awakening, not the glamorous kind, but the painful realization that technical beauty without emotional truth meant nothing. At Bernard's High School, Meryl was popular in that strange, unintentional way, elected prom queen, yet privately convinced it was a joke. "They voted for someone I didn't recognize," she once said. Her self-perception had always been at odds with how the world saw her. She didn't think she was beautiful. She didn't think she belonged. That quiet fracture between who she felt she was and who others decided she must be became the invisible thread running through her life and art. Acting entered almost by accident. She joined the drama club because it was easier to be someone else than to explain herself. In those first school plays, something miraculous happened. Every role became a refuge, a place to explore emotions she couldn't express in her own name. "When you don't feel like you're enough," she once said, "you learn to become anything." That sentence would later define her entire career. After high school, she attended Vassar College, a haven for bright, restless young women who were beginning to challenge the world's expectations. Meryl entered intending to study law or English literature, but the stage kept calling. At Vassar, her professors noticed something rare. She didn't perform roles, she became them. A classmate once said, "Watching Meryl act was unnerving. You couldn't see the line where she disappeared and the character began." Still, she didn't think of acting as destiny. She was practical, wary of failure. Her father worried about unstable careers. Her mother, ever the dreamer, told her to chase what set her heart alight. The tension between realism and imagination, her father's world and her mother's, followed her everywhere. It was the same tension that would one day make her performances feel both precise and transcendent. In 1971, she entered the Yale School of Drama, widely regarded as the most demanding acting program in the country. It should have been triumph the moment a dream began. Instead, it nearly destroyed her. Tuition was crushing, schedules brutal, and competition relentless. She juggled part-time jobs, sleepless rehearsals, and a dozen productions each semester. By 1973, the stress had carved into her body. She developed bleeding stomach ulcers. She would later say, "I felt like I was unraveling from the inside." But in that crucible, Meryl forged herself. She learned that pain and art were not enemies, they were partners. Every exhaustion, every self-doubt became material. I wasn't pretending anymore, she said. This started one of Vildio. When she graduated in 1975, she was 26, physically drained, but spiritually sharpened. She left Yale with more than a degree. She carried an unspoken vow: never to act without truth, never to speak without meaning. The world saw a promising actress. She saw a survivor of her own ambition. In New York City, she lived modestly, scraping by on off-Broadway roles that paid next to nothing. Her early performances weren't noticed by the masses, but the few who saw her felt something strange and immediate. One critic wrote, "She burns quietly, but she burns through you." That line would become prophecy. Because long before she was Meryl Streep, the icon, she was a quiet girl with a bruised heart, an unclaimed voice, and a lifelong hunger to make sense of human pain. Every tear on screen, every tremor in her voice, every haunted glance, it all began here, in the silence of her childhood and the loneliness of her youth. The legend was not born in Hollywood. It was born in the quiet ache of being unseen. When Meryl Streep stepped into New York City in the mid-1970s, she wasn't chasing stardom, she was chasing survival. The skyline glittered like a promise, but beneath the lights lay exhaustion, rejection, and the invisible battle every artist wages with obscurity. She lived in a small apartment, auditioned endlessly, and took every stage that would have her, from half-empty theaters to drafty rehearsal halls with broken lights. The audiences were small, but her conviction was enormous. In 1975, she joined the Public Theater, founded by Joseph Papp, a space where raw talent collided with ambition, where Shakespeare was performed under the same roof as protest plays. There, Meryl's name began to circulate quietly among New York's artistic elite. She had no Hollywood polish, no marketing machine. What she had was presence, a calm, unsettling stillness that made every other actor on stage recalibrate. Critics began to notice her ability to disappear entirely into her characters. "She doesn't act," one reviewer wrote. "She simply exists." Yet beneath that rising talent burned a quiet fear, the fear that she was not enough. She once admitted, "I kept waiting for someone to tap me on the shoulder and say, 'You don't belong here.'" That insecurity didn't fade when she began winning roles. It only deepened, becoming the emotional core of her performances. Every glance, every hesitation carried that same human doubt, and audiences, often without realizing why, leaned closer. Her first film appearance came in 1977's Julia, a brief role lasting barely minutes. But something about her on-screen stillness, the intelligence behind her eyes, caught the attention of casting directors. Then, as if by fate, came The Deer Hunter in 1978. The production was chaotic, the tone dark, the story heavy. But for Meryl, the film wasn't just a job, it was a lifeline, because her partner, the brilliant actor John Cazale, was dying of terminal lung cancer. Cazale, best known as Fredo Corleone in The Godfather, was Meryl's great love. When he was diagnosed, she refused to leave his side. She nursed him between shoots, negotiated with producers to keep him employed despite his illness, and slept beside his hospital bed. "It was the most beautiful thing that ever happened to me," she said later. John died in March 1978. He was only 42. Meryl was 28. She didn't take time to grieve. She couldn't afford to. 6 months later, she married sculptor Don Gummer, a friend who had helped her pack up John's belongings. Some saw it as too soon, too strange, but Meryl never justified it. That same year, The Deer Hunter premiered. Her performance, raw, trembling, heartbreak incarnate, earned her first Oscar nomination. But the public didn't know that the grief on screen was not acting. It was autobiography. The applause, though thunderous, must have felt cruel. How do you celebrate a role that was born from death? In 1979 came Kramer versus Kramer. She played Joanna, a mother torn between love and guilt, duty and identity. The film was a cultural earthquake. Divorce was still taboo, and Streep's portrayal forced audiences to see the complexity in a woman who leaves not as a villain, but as human. The film earned her first Oscar win. Yet even at the height of triumph, she seemed almost reluctant to own it. It's nice, she said, but it's not real life. Real life, for Meryl, remained offstage, a balancing act between an accelerating career and a desire for quiet domesticity. Fame, she knew, was volatile. Fame is a costume, she said. You can wear it, but don't let it wear you. The early 1980 seconds cemented her as something more than an actress, a force. The French Lieutenant's Woman, 1000, and especially Sophie's Choice, 1982, the performance that would redefine cinematic grief. She learned Polish and German for the role, lost weight until she looked like a shadow, and lived inside Sophie's trauma until it haunted her dreams. The pivotal scene, Sophie's impossible choice between her two children, broke not only audiences, but Meryl herself. It shattered me, she later admitted. It lived in my body for months. These weren't roles, they were exorcisms. Every performance demanded a piece of her sanity, and she gave it willingly, believing truth in art was worth the sacrifice. Acting, she said, is about entering someone else's skin, then finding your way back out if you can. But sometimes she couldn't. After Sophie's Choice, she isolated herself for weeks. Friends worried, her husband worried. Yet when she returned, she came back fiercer, wiser, and quieter. The industry crowned her the queen of authenticity. Her peers, however, didn't always cheer. Some, like Katharine Hepburn, called her too technical. Others resented her perfection. But Meryl never responded. She had already learned the most valuable lesson of fame. Silence is stronger than defense. By the mid-1980 seconds, she had conquered the very system she once feared. The great gift of human beings, she said in one interview, is that we have the power of empathy. That empathy had carried her from a lonely girl in New Jersey to the most revered actress in the world. Yet behind the triumphs, another truth was forming: the more she gave to the world, the less of herself she kept. By the late 1980 seconds, Meryl Streep was no longer just an actress, she was a monument. Critics wrote about her as if she were a movement, a standard against which every performance would be measured. Yet for Meryl, success never felt like a crown. It felt like a contract, a lifelong obligation to keep being extraordinary, no matter the cost. From Out of Africa to A Cry in the Dark, she carried stories that transcended cinema, breathing life into characters who seemed too complex, too broken, too human for the screen. In Out of Africa, 1985, as Karen Blixen, she portrayed longing not as weakness, but as endurance. The wide African plains, the wind, the silence. It was all a metaphor for the woman herself. Vast, aching, and uncontainable. That role won her another Oscar nomination, but it was the quiet behind the performance that defined her. Every time I finish a film, she said, I feel emptied out, like I've left part of myself somewhere I'll never get back. The early 1990 seconds were supposed to be her era of ease, the moment she could enjoy her legacy. But Hollywood has never been kind to women who age gracefully instead of desperately. By the time she turned 40, the scripts arriving at her door began to change tone. They were flatter, safer, smaller. I was suddenly offered witches, mothers-in-law. Yet rather than fading, she reinvented. In Postcards from the Edge, 1990, written by Carrie Fisher, Meryl turned vulnerability into comedy, mocking her own reputation for being serious. In The Bridges of Madison County, 1995, in A Manson Doing Madison, in Tales for Getty in the Madison, she delivered perhaps the most sensual performance of her career, not with body, but with eyes, silence, and restraint. The film was quiet, slow. Clint Eastwood said later, she could break your heart with a look and then heal it in the same scene. The world saw glamour, but what Meryl lived was exhaustion. Fame, she often said, was like a mirror that doesn't reflect the truth. Between film shoots, she returned home to Connecticut, where she raised 4 children away from paparazzi lenses. She read bedtime stories between takes, answered fan mail at the kitchen table, and tried to stay small while the world made her enormous. I don't want to be admired, she told a friend. I just want to be understood. Her marriage to sculptor Don Gummer was a sanctuary for a time. They built a quiet life that defied the Hollywood narrative. 4 decades of apparent stability, shared art, shared solitude. Friends later said they rarely saw Meryl confide, even in dawn. Her grief for John Cazale had become something she carried alone, like an amulet. That pain never left me, she admitted in one rare interview. It just learned to stay quiet. Through the 2000s, she entered a new kind of fame, not youthful, but regal. The Hours, 2002, earned her yet another Oscar nomination, and The Devil Wears Prada, 2006. As Miranda Priestley, she channeled decades of quiet rage, the exhaustion of being the best, and the loneliness that comes with it. I didn't want her to be cruel, Meryl said. I wanted her to be tired. Her co-star Anne Hathaway would later say, she was terrifying, but it wasn't arrogance. Even as her legend grew, Meryl refused to play the game. She avoided social media, ignored the cult of celebrity, and stayed immune to the glitter. When asked why she rarely discussed her private life, she smiled. Because it's mine. That quiet defiance, the refusal to feed a world addicted to noise, became her rebellion. But the truth behind her endurance was more fragile than it looked. Years of emotional immersion had left scars. She once confessed, I carry every role with me. I try to leave them behind, but some cling like ghosts. After filming The Iron Lady, 2011, in which she portrayed Margaret Thatcher's descent into dementia, Meryl found herself shaken by how closely the role mirrored her own fears. It frightened me, she said. It felt like a mirror I didn't want to look into. That fear became prophecy in its own way, not through illness, but through solitude. In 2017, quietly and without announcement, Meryl and Don separated after nearly 40 years of marriage. They told no one. They fought no battles. They simply grew apart and stayed kind. For 6 years, the world assumed they were together. When the truth emerged in 2023, fans were shocked. But Meryl? She kept wearing her wedding ring. When asked why, she only said, some stories don't end. The irony was painful. She had spent a lifetime portraying women holding families together, surviving heartbreak with poise, and now she was living it in silence. Friends say she spends much of her time at her home in Salisbury, Connecticut, surrounded by nature and quiet. She still reads scripts, but only the ones that her fortune over $100 million could buy her anything, yet she lives modestly, funding scholarships and charities instead of galas. She donated her entire Iron Lady salary to the National Women's History Museum and established scholarships for English and math students in memory of lost friends. Her wealth never turned into armor. It became empathy. Even now, when she steps onto a set like her recent turn in Only Murders in the Building, the old fire glows behind her eyes. Her co-stars describe her as radiant but distant, and maybe she does, because her performances have always been ghosts of the past, fragments of love, loss, and longing stitched together with elegance and pain. At 76, Meryl Streep's career is no longer about conquering. It's about returning to the girl in glasses, the one who once felt invisible and learned to survive by becoming everyone else. Every time she acts, she finds her way back to that girl, offering her something she never had before. The peak of her fame wasn't an award. It wasn't Sophie's Choice or the Iron Lady. It was this: surviving fame itself without losing the softness that made her human. Every legend pays a quiet tax for greatness. For Meryl Streep, it wasn't scandal or destruction, it was something far lonelier. The erosion of peace. The tragedy of her life was not a single event, but a long, invisible unraveling that came with the weight of always being perfect. Behind the graceful smiles and carefully chosen words, there were years when she drifted further from herself. The public adored her, but she lived with a haunting sense of emotional fatigue, as if every role had extracted something sacred. Every time I finish a film, she once confessed, it takes a while to find me again. The danger was that sometimes she couldn't. After decades of living inside other people's lives, the Holocaust survivor in Sophie's Choice, the whistleblower in Silkwood, the aging prime minister losing her mind in The Iron Lady, Meryl began to notice an unsettling blur between art and identity. It's not that I lose myself in a role, she told a friend. It's that I have to cut pieces of myself away to make room for them. This slow disintegration of self is the cost. No one talks about the cost of empathy at its highest voltage. It doesn't explode, it corrodes. And Meryl carried that corrosion quietly, hidden beneath her poise. She never indulged in public breakdowns or tabloid confessions, but those who worked closely with her noticed something shift after the Iron Lady. Her silences grew longer, her smiles less frequent. One assistant later said, "She wasn't sad, she was tired. You could feel it in the air." Around this time, the rumors began whispers that Meryl had retreated not for privacy, but for protection. In Hollywood, even silence becomes a story. Some tabloids speculated about illness, others about marriage trouble, but the truth was simpler and sadder. She was exhausted by pretending that strength comes without pain. Then came the revelation that shattered her image of quiet domestic bliss. In 2023, the world discovered that Meryl and Don Gummer had been separated since 2017. 6 years of private distance, 6 years of wearing a ring to keep the world at bay. When the news broke, her team released a single, measured statement. They have been separated for some time, but will always care for each other. Just an ending wrapped in grace. But grace can hurt. For a woman who once devoted her art to portraying love in all its contradictions, the silent end of her own marriage must have felt like a cruel echo of her character's pain. In The Bridges of Madison County, she had once said through tears, "This kind of certainty comes but once in a lifetime." That line, written for another woman, might as well have been written for her younger self. The one who watched John Cazale die and still found the strength to love again. And yet, Meryl never let tragedy harden her. It refined her, distilling her life into something both fragile and enduring. Her closest friends say she found a strange peace in solitude, surrounded by her gardens in Connecticut, reading poetry and tending to the silence she once feared. But there are ghosts in that house, memories of John's laughter, Don's sculptures, and the 4 children who grew up watching her balance greatness and grief with impossible composure. Still, even the most graceful lives are not immune to the cruelty of public judgment. Hollywood, fickle as ever, began to turn its gaze elsewhere. Younger faces, louder stories, shinier controversies. The woman who had once been the axis of cinema was now spoken of in the past tense. Awards shows that used to tremble at her arrival now used her name for tribute montages. And that, perhaps, was the sharpest cut of all. To be alive, and yet already mythologized, applauded not for what you are, but for what you were. Critics began to whisper that her era had passed. Some even questioned her relevance. "Hollywood loves its icons," one commentator wrote, "but it doesn't love watching them age." Meryl never answered because she didn't need to. Her silence was her rebellion. She continued to work on her terms, taking roles like Only Murders in the Building, comedic, self-aware, and quietly luminous. It was her way of reminding the world, legends don't fade, they transform. But beneath that poise, friends noticed a subtle melancholy. She had lost too many things quietly: a partner, a marriage, her privacy, her youth. The grief of John Cazale never left her. The comfort of marriage slipped through her hands like dust. And the endless demand for excellence, even in her 70s, never stopped pressing on her shoulders. "When you've been everyone," she once mused, "who do you get to be when the lights go out?" That is the real mystery of Meryl Streep, not what she's hiding, but how she's still standing. The world remembers the roles, the awards, the immortality, but what it doesn't see is the woman behind the legend, sitting in her quiet house, her hands still, her gaze distant, wondering what remains of herself after 50 years of giving everything away. Her tragedy was never scandal. It was sacrifice. Every masterpiece cost her a little more of her soul, and she gave it willingly until even giving began to hurt. The pain she carried became the truth she gave us. That's why we believed her, because she lived every sorrow she portrayed. At 76, her body has slowed. She has learned that the applause of the world is fleeting, but peace, even the fragile kind, is sacred. And yet, when she walks into a room, something still happens. Conversations hush. Meryl Streep's downfall was never about loss. It was about the cost of empathy, to feel everything, to carry everyone, and still find enough of yourself left to continue. In her 76th year, Meryl Streep has entered the rarest season of fame, the one where applause becomes memory and legacy begins to whisper back. The world calls her a legend. She calls herself a working actress. That humility, equal parts defiance and exhaustion, is what keeps her grounded in a world that long ago stopped feeling real. She lives mostly in Connecticut now, tucked behind the stone walls and green hush of Salisbury. The property stretches across nearly 90 acres, wild meadows, quiet ponds, and trees that remember more than they reveal. Neighbors say she walks most mornings at dawn, long before the press or the noise of the day arrives. Sometimes she is seen alone, sometimes with a grandchild toddling beside her, hand in hand, moving slowly through the mist. There's something cinematic in that image, the woman who once carried the grief of nations now at peace with the small rhythms of life. Her daily rituals are simple: black coffee, classical music. The house itself is modest for someone of her stature, filled with sunlight, old books, and the kind of stillness that feels earned. "I don't need much," she once said. "I have everything that matters: quiet, love, and memory." Professionally, she has not retired, though her pace has softened. When she chooses to appear, it is deliberate, an act of faith, not ambition. Her role in Only Murders in the Building reminded audiences that her brilliance had not dimmed, merely shifted tone. She no longer plays women running toward life. She plays women reflecting on it. Her performances now are gentler but deeper. Her presence on set is said to be almost reverent, calm, precise, patient. Younger actors speak of her as if she were a myth come to life, a guardian of truth in an industry built on illusion. "When she walks in," one co-star said, "you can feel time slow down." And yet, beneath the serenity lies an unspoken ache. Since her quiet separation from Don Gummer in 2017, she has lived between two forms of solitude, one peaceful, one heavy. They remain friends, but their lives diverged long ago. Still, she continues to wear her gold wedding ring, perhaps as a symbol not of denial, but of gratitude, a private acknowledgement of the decades that once held her. "Love doesn't always vanish," she told a close friend. "Sometimes it just changes shape." Her children, Henry, Mamie, Grace, and Louisa, are grown now, scattered between New York and Los Angeles. Each of them carries a flicker of her creative fire, yet all speak of her not as an icon, but as a mother who made space for their voices. When Meryl Streep once said, "My mom taught me that greatness has to be quiet," the world heard a truth that defined the entire Streep legacy. Physically, Meryl has aged with grace, but not without consequence. Decades of filming, travel, and emotional immersion have taken their toll. Her back aches, her energy dips, her once boundless endurance now measured carefully. But her mind, that razor-sharp, empathetic mind, remains untouched. She reads voraciously. Philosophy, history, memoirs of forgotten women. "You can't play a soul you don't understand," she once said. "So I keep learning." Her relationship with fame has become almost ghost-like. She attends events rarely, speaks less, and grants interviews only when she has something to say, not something to sell. There are no social media accounts, no curated images. Her silence has become her final performance, a rebellion against a culture that mistakes exposure for existence. When she does appear, her presence feels almost spectral, as if the world is glimpsing a myth it wasn't sure was real anymore. Decades of filming, travel, and emotional immersion have taken their toll. Her back aches, her energy dips, her once boundless endurance now measured carefully. But her mind, that razor-sharp, empathetic mind, remains untouched. She reads voraciously. Philosophy, history, memoirs of forgotten women. "You can't play a soul you don't understand," she once said. "So I keep learning." Her relationship with fame has become almost ghost-like. She attends events rarely, speaks less, and grants interviews only when she has something to say, not something to sell. There are no social media accounts, no curated images. Her silence has become her final performance, a rebellion against a culture that mistakes exposure for existence. When she does appear, her presence feels almost spectral, as if the world is glimpsing a myth it wasn't sure was real anymore. Meryl Streep's legacy doesn't live in the trophies she's gathered, though they are countless, but in the quiet recalibration of what it means to be true. She didn't just redefine acting, she redefined sincerity. Before her, the industry celebrated beauty and charisma. After her, it worshipped depth. What makes her legacy hauntingly powerful is how invisible it often feels. There is no monument, no museum, no scandal to etch her name in neon. Instead, her influence ripples through generations of artists who learn from her that power can whisper and emotion can exist in a single, trembling breath. When she began her career, women in Hollywood were ornamental, decorative figures orbiting male heroes. Meryl shattered that orbit. She played women with inner landscapes so vast that they changed how audiences saw the female experience itself. Sophie's Choice wasn't just a film about tragedy. It was a film about the unbearable complexity of motherhood. Silkwood wasn't just political, it was an anthem of moral courage. And The Devil Wears Prada transformed ambition, authority, and feminine power into something terrifyingly magnetic. The industry learned from her, sometimes reluctantly, that truth sells better than fantasy. Before Meryl, a woman over 40 in Hollywood was past her prime. After Meryl, she was just beginning. She became proof that time doesn't destroy relevance. It deepens it. She opened doors without ever claiming credit. Julianne Moore, Viola Davis, Kate Blanchett, all have spoken about how her existence gave them permission to explore vulnerability without shame. Viola Davis once said, "When Meryl looks at you, she doesn't see color or status. She sees truth, and she demands you meet her there. That is her true legacy, not domination, but invitation." Even her flaws became instructive. Some accused her of being too polished, too intellectual, too perfect. But those criticisms only proved her point that women are rarely forgiven for excellence. She wore those judgments like armor and kept working. Her influence stretches far beyond cinema. Meryl has been a consistent voice for empathy, equality, and education. Her $1 million donation to the National Women's History Museum and her scholarships for underprivileged students were not acts of charity. They were statements. She never shouted her activism. She embodied it. Culturally, she became a paradox, adored and untouchable everywhere and nowhere. Younger generations quote Miranda Priestley's lines without realizing they're reciting an indictment of how women are perceived in power. Her filmography is now a psychological map of female resilience, charting decades of how women have evolved, fought, and refused to vanish. She didn't chase the zeitgeist. She shaped it. When others reinvented themselves to stay visible, Meryl stayed still, and the world moved around her. That stillness became her brand, an antidote to the chaos of celebrity culture. She made invisibility glamorous again. But perhaps her greatest contribution is emotional literacy. She taught audiences that empathy isn't softness, it's courage. In an era addicted to irony and detachment, Meryl dared to feel deeply, to cry without embarrassment, to reveal how heavy the act of understanding another human being can be. Younger generations quote Miranda Priestley's lines without realizing they're reciting an indictment of how women are perceived in power. Her filmography is now a psychological map of female resilience, charting decades of how women have evolved, fought, and refused to vanish. She didn't chase the zeitgeist. She shaped it. When others reinvented themselves to stay visible, Meryl stayed still, and the world moved around her. That stillness became her brand, an antidote to the chaos of celebrity culture. She made invisibility glamorous again. But perhaps her greatest contribution is emotional literacy. She taught audiences that empathy isn't softness, it's courage. In an era addicted to irony and detachment, Meryl dared to feel deeply, to cry without embarrassment, to reveal how heavy the act of understanding another human being can be. In a culture that consumes and discards, she endures because she never sold herself, only her truth. To speak about Meryl Streep is to speak about the quiet miracle of endurance, not the glamorous, loud kind that fills headlines, but the kind that happens in silence, behind closed doors, when no one is watching. She has lived the impossible paradox of fame, to be worshipped for her humanity while being slowly stripped of her right to be human. There's a temptation, when discussing legends, to flatten them, to turn them into symbols rather than people. Her genius was not in being extraordinary, but in showing us how the extraordinary lives inside the ordinary. She made us see the divinity in discomfort, the poetry in imperfection. When we watched her on screen, we didn't see Meryl Streep. We saw ourselves raw, conflicted, hopeful, and afraid. The tragedy, if it can be called that, is that her real life mirrored her art too closely. She spent a lifetime exploring grief, love, and endurance through her characters, only to find those same shadows waiting for her offstage. The loss of John Cazale, the quiet separation from Don Gummer, The decades of emotional labor that came with motherhood and fame all became invisible performances, unseen but deeply felt. Some critics say she has no flaws, that she's too perfect to be interesting. But that's a lazy interpretation. Her flaw has always been honesty. She refused to perform celebrity the way others perform roles. She refused to surrender her pain to public consumption. She never gave us gossip, she gave us depth. And perhaps that's why some audiences find her intimidating. Real truth is hard to look at. We saw ourselves raw, conflicted, hopeful, and afraid. The tragedy, if it can be called that, is that her real life mirrored her art too closely. She spent a lifetime exploring grief, love, and endurance through her characters, only to find those same shadows waiting for her offstage. The loss of John Cazale, the quiet separation from Don Gummer, the decades of emotional labor that came with motherhood and fame, all became invisible performances, unseen but deeply felt. Some critics say she has no flaws, that she's too perfect to be interesting. But that's a lazy interpretation. Her flaw has always been honesty. She refused to perform celebrity the way others perform roles. She refused to surrender her pain to public consumption. She never gave us gossip, she gave us depth. And perhaps that's why some audiences find her intimidating. Real truth is hard to look at. Every tear she shed on screen was a real one borrowed from somewhere in her past. Every silence was filled with memory. Every triumph carried the ghost of what it cost her. She didn't just act pain, she understood it. There's something almost sacred in that kind of power, the power to heal by being seen. Her legacy isn't a cautionary tale, nor is it pure triumph. It's a balance between loss and creation, solitude and grace. She shows us that greatness isn't about being adored, it's about being authentic. And authenticity, especially in Hollywood, is the most fragile form of courage. So as we look back on her journey, the brilliance, the heartbreak, the silence, one question remains: how much can one soul give before it runs out of itself? Maybe that's the price of immortality. Maybe that's the tragedy of being human. Somewhere in the Connecticut twilight, Meryl Streep sits by a window. The applause is gone now. The cameras are sleeping. Only the echo remains, the echo of a lifetime spent feeling too much, giving too much, becoming everyone but herself. She has lived 1,000 lives and died 1,000 deaths, all for us. And yet, the most haunting part of her story is not what she became, but what she gave away to become it. For every tear shed on screen, there was another, unseen, in the privacy of her own reflection. Fame has long forgotten how to honor silence, but Meryl built her legend from it. She made empathy look like strength and restraint look like rebellion. Time, that old director, has been kind and cruel in equal measure. It has stolen youth but left behind grace. It has taken applause but given her peace. When she speaks now, her voice carries a stillness that feels almost sacred, as though each word has been weighed, measured, and finally forgiven. If you look closely, you can still see traces of her journey. The shy girl in thick glasses who sang opera she didn't believe in. The young woman holding John Cazale's hand as life slipped away. The mother who tried to balance art and home. The wife who chose silence over spectacle. Each of them still lives inside her, flickering like candlelight through the decades. And perhaps that is the true magic of Meryl Streep. She never needed immortality. She already was it. She didn't carve her name into marble or chase forever through scandal or vanity. She simply lived, with grace so unshakable it became eternal. Her life is not a story of rise and fall. It is a story of constancy, the unwavering belief that feeling deeply is not a weakness, but a form of resistance. There will come a time when her voice will fade from interviews, when new faces fill the screen, and Hollywood, ever hungry, will move on. But somewhere, someone will still whisper her lines from Sophie's Choice, still smile at The Devil Wears Prada, still weep for her out of Africa. Because art like hers doesn't end, it lingers, reshaping those who witness it. One day, long after she's gone, someone will stumble upon one of her films, not knowing the legend, not knowing the fame, just the feeling. And in that moment, they'll understand why the world once fell silent for a woman named Meryl. Some stories were never meant to be known, but now, you know.